On a cold winter day in late 1937, Hitler summoned Germany's top military leaders to a meeting at his headquarters. Among those present were General Werner von Blomberg, Germany's Minister for War, and General Werner von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The generals expected a routine discussion, but Hitler stunned them from the start by declaring that what he was about to reveal should be considered his last will and testament. He outlined his plans for military expansion. The first step was to unite German-speaking populations, many of whom lived in countries like Austria and Czechoslovakia following the post-World War I division of Europe. The second step was to move eastward, seizing territory in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to provide the German people with additional living space, or Lebensraum, a vision he had nurtured for nearly 20 years. While some generals agreed with his goals, Hitler then revealed an ambitious timetable. German troops should annex Austria and Czechoslovakia within a year, with further eastern territories to follow in subsequent years. The generals were alarmed. Europe's borders were protected by the military strength of Britain and France, and Hitler's plans appeared to rush Germany toward a suicidal war. When they left the meeting, distrust and unease ran high. The generals' main concern was that Germany's armed forces were not ready for war in late 1937 and early 1938. They decided that at least one or two of them should voice their objections to Hitler. Blomberg agreed to speak up. Although he was generally sympathetic to the Nazis, even he was shocked by Hitler's aggressive expansionist plans. Fritsch, likewise horrified, joined him. But Hitler refused to listen, doubting both their loyalty and whether he could execute his plans with them in positions of power. Meanwhile, the Gestapo began compiling information to neutralize opposition. Their target was von Blomberg. A file revealed that Blomberg's young wife, whom Hitler had witnessed marrying him, had a scandalous past. She had been a prostitute and had posed for pornographic photographs. She was also a frequent presence in Berlin's nightclubs, making her an unsuitable partner for a senior military leader. The file was sent to Hitler, who, a notorious prude, was appalled. This scandal conveniently gave him a way to remove Blomberg as a threat. Blomberg was summoned and given a choice: resign or face public humiliation. He chose to resign. Shortly afterward, Fritsch was summoned. A file emerged suggesting he had engaged in homosexual activity, which, to the Nazis, was unacceptable. Hitler, who was intensely homophobic, forced Fritsch to resign. Hitler then abolished the position of war minister and appointed himself supreme commander of the German army. By late 1938, Hitler had far greater control over the military than ever before. The army, once semi-independent, was now subordinated entirely to his will. Yet Hitler still faced a challenge: the German people had elected him as a man of peace. How could he pursue expansionist ambitions while maintaining that image? In the spring of 1938, he began to execute his plans. German troops crossed the border into Austria, where they were met with cheering crowds. Many Austrians were ethnically German and happily welcomed their return to the Reich. Within days, Hitler arrived in Vienna to claim Austria for a greater Germany. Photographs capture him addressing 300,000 people at the Heldenplatz, the city's square of heroes. Although the annexation violated international agreements, Britain and France took no action. Hitler had carefully calculated that they would avoid war, and his gamble paid off. In Germany, the population celebrated. Hitler had achieved the first step toward a greater Germany without shedding blood, fulfilling his promise to avoid war. Nazi propaganda amplified the victory, portraying the annexation as a near-bloodless triumph. The German people, euphoric, saw Hitler as a leader who had restored Austria to the Reich almost without a fight. At the time, he was seen as a hero. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and close confidant, spoke for many when he wrote, "The Führer is wonderful, a real genius. He sits over maps for hours and broods. It's stirring when he says he wishes to live to see the greater Germanic Reich again." Yet behind the scenes, Hitler and some of his closest collaborators were planning another aggressive expansion of Germany's borders. 5 months after the annexation of Austria, Hitler massed troops on the border with Czechoslovakia and threatened an invasion. The country had a large German minority, most of whom lived in a border region known as the Sudetenland. This area was the next target on Hitler's list for incorporation into a new Greater Germany. He believed that the German people had the right to live together in a single, large nation-state. To him, this was a natural and just cause, and he made it the centerpiece of his foreign policy without hesitation. However, unlike the Austrians, the Czechs were unwilling to cede territory, and Czech sovereignty was guaranteed by France and supported by Britain. Hitler needed to maintain the illusion to the German people that he was a man of peace. If conflict occurred, it should not appear to be his fault. This task fell to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine. Newsreels portrayed the Sudeten Germans as a people longing to join Greater Germany. Prior propaganda had already painted them as persecuted under Czech rule, denied equal rights, and prevented from fulfilling their legitimate desire to unite with Germany. Hitler skillfully presented this oppression to the world, and particularly to his own people, as a moral crusade for Germany. In the Sudetenland, Nazi sympathizers secretly stirred trouble. A well-organized group of Nazis magnified any incident of oppression against the Germans. This was a classic Nazi tactic: provoke unrest, then ensure it received maximum media coverage. Every newsreel highlighted the suffering of Germans in the Sudetenland. Our people, our German brothers and sisters, are being oppressed in an appalling way in the Sudetenland. This cannot continue. We must intervene. The anger generated by this propaganda was highly effective. Hitler could now mobilize the army under the guise of protecting a defenseless German population. Despite his popularity, Hitler remained insecure. That summer, he took steps to consolidate his power further. He feared that although the army had sworn an oath of loyalty to him, not everyone could be trusted at all times. He needed an alternative source of military power, and he found it in the Waffen-SS, the Nazi Party's armed paramilitary wing. Members of the SS were fanatical Nazis who met strict racial criteria: tall, blonde, of pure Nordic blood for at least 3 generations. They swore allegiance to Hitler, tattooed their blood group on their arms, and were committed to Nazi ideology, willing to kill without hesitation. Their presence intimidated ordinary Germans and regular soldiers alike. In 1938, the Waffen-SS rapidly expanded, establishing its own training schools. This provided better equipment and training while forging a tightly knit, elite corps devoted to Nazism and the extermination of communists and Jews. They were special, separate, and answerable only to Hitler, which made them a terrifying force. In effect, they were Hitler's private army, his safeguard in case the regular military turned against him. This proved to be a wise precaution, as signs of dissent were already appearing within the military. That summer, an extraordinary scene unfolded at a cathedral in the German capital. A group of military officers sought release from their oath of loyalty to Hitler from the cathedral's cannon. Among them was Colonel Hans Oster of German military intelligence. Once an early supporter of the Nazis, he now believed Hitler was leading Germany toward a suicidal war. The cannon, also a dissident, assured them Hitler was a tyrant and they were under no moral obligation to obey him. For many senior officers, this was a difficult step. As Hitler was their commander-in-chief, they needed the Church's absolution to prepare for their planned actions. The conspirators had support from influential figures in the German military, including General Erwin von Witzleben, commander of the Berlin Army, and Fritz von Schulenburg, vice president of the Berlin Police. Both were alarmed by Hitler's dismissal of Blomberg and Fritsch and his willingness to risk war with Britain and France. Many of those plotting against Hitler were individuals who might normally have been considered his natural supporters, senior military and police personnel who had once backed the Nazis but now feared being drawn into reckless foreign policy adventures. Determined to stop Hitler, Oster and his colleagues left the cathedral and spent the following months laying plans. Their goal was to arrest Hitler and remove him from power, carefully scouting locations in Berlin where this might be possible. The main unresolved question was when to act. Meanwhile, German troops continued to prepare for war on the Czech border, even though France and Britain remained guarantors of Czech sovereignty. Despite these tensions, Hitler publicly maintained that he did not want war. In a September speech to the German people, he proclaimed, "I demand that the oppression of these Germans in Czechoslovakia ceases." Hitler had a very effective strategy. He always presented himself as a man of peace. He constantly emphasized that he was a former frontline soldier. Why would he, of all people, want to provoke another war? Yet, he framed himself as someone under immense pressure from his own people and from the minorities he claimed to be protecting. The clock was ticking, and war seemed imminent. Would the invasion of Czechoslovakia proceed, or could conspirators within the army stop Hitler before he plunged Germany into a reckless conflict? Suddenly, a dramatic development unfolded. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had been watching Hitler's saber-rattling with growing concern. He decided to leave London for a personal meeting with Hitler, hoping that their discussion might yield some positive outcome. On the morning of his departure to Germany, Chamberlain was sent off from the airport by cheering crowds. In Germany, he was received by Hitler at the Berghof, the dictator's mountain retreat in the Alps. Chamberlain and Hitler were strikingly different. The former was 69, the latter 49. Chamberlain must have seemed out of place among Germans in their Nazi uniforms, with his wing collar, tie, and rolled-up umbrella. He looked every bit the traditional statesman, while Hitler was, unmistakably, a new and aggressive force. The meeting symbolized a clash of cultures, the old Edwardian school of British diplomacy, represented by Chamberlain, versus the radical, confrontational Nazi movement. Appropriately, a thunderstorm broke overhead that day, foreshadowing the stormy encounters to come. Chamberlain, like many who first met Hitler, was impressed by his charisma and forceful personality. Hitler, in turn, used this impression to advance his own goals. He once again portrayed himself as a man of peace, arguing that he simply wanted to help his fellow Germans. He demanded that the Sudetenland be allowed to vote on whether it should secede from Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain seemed to accept the argument and agreed to present it to the French and Czech governments, but he left the Berghof having made a poor impression on his hosts. After Chamberlain departed, the Germans reportedly laughed at him behind closed doors. They saw him as someone they could easily manipulate. Meanwhile, in Berlin, conspirators within the army were not deceived by Hitler's peaceful facade. They carefully planned their next moves to ensure they were not being followed, taking extraordinary precautions such as walking together in parks to spot potential tails or meeting in a swimming pool to evade Gestapo surveillance. A critical question remained unresolved: what to do with Hitler once he was arrested? Most conspirators favored a trial, but not everyone agreed. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, a former right-wing thug with a colorful history, argued differently. Having fought in World War I and in multiple radical paramilitary groups of the 1920s, Heinz supported the Nazi cause but opposed Hitler's leadership. He warned Oster, the rebellion's key strategist, that keeping Hitler alive would preserve his power. He insisted Hitler needed to be killed. They reached a secret understanding: Hitler would be shot amid the confusion of his arrest, making his assassination a very real possibility. 5 days after his first meeting, Chamberlain returned to Germany for a second encounter in the spa town of Bad Godesberg, on the Rhine. Chamberlain stayed at the Petersburg Hotel, while Hitler lodged at the Dran, his preferred retreat. The Dran's owner, a staunch Nazi, had a curious side business. Whenever Hitler stayed, he would auction off items from Hitler's room to make extra money. The meeting began with Chamberlain optimistic. He told Hitler that Britain had persuaded the French and Czech governments to accept Germany's demand that the Sudetenland be allowed a vote on joining Germany. War, he believed, could be avoided. Relaxing in his chair, he seemed confident in his accomplishment. But Hitler's response was dramatic. He thumped the table, declaring the rules had changed. His theatrics, complete with foaming rage, left Chamberlain stunned. Hitler announced he no longer wanted a vote, famously earning the nickname the carpet biter for his rabid, aggressive behavior. He claimed the situation in the Sudetenland was dire, with hundreds of Germans supposedly being killed daily. Unless the Czechs surrendered immediately, Hitler vowed to invade. Chamberlain was speechless. The situation had not only returned to square one, it had regressed further. Hitler continued to apply pressure, sending a stream of messengers. One courier delivered a note claiming 300 Germans had been massacred in the Sudetenland, a complete fabrication meant to manipulate Chamberlain. Forced to believe these reports, he had no choice but to react seriously. The meeting ended late, leaving Chamberlain deeply troubled. He faced a monumental decision: either justify Hitler's territorial ambitions to the world or prepare Britain for war. He eventually made his stance clear in the House of Commons, calling Hitler's threatened invasion of the Sudetenland merely a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Meanwhile, in Berlin, army conspirators watched anxiously as Hitler continued steering Germany toward conflict. They couldn't believe that the British would give in to Hitler's latest demand. Desperate to stop him, they finalized their plans. The invasion could be only days away. At an army garrison in Berlin, Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz assembled a small team. Their plan was to arrest Hitler as soon as he ordered the invasion of the Sudetenland. Arms, ammunition, and hand grenades were handed out. The conspirators checked their weapons, but then something occurred that they had not anticipated. Europe's great powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, gathered in Munich for a final attempt to resolve the Sudeten crisis. The meeting was held at the FAD, the enormous Nazi headquarters in Munich. The atmosphere was tense throughout. Everyone present was convinced that time was running out to prevent a second catastrophic war in Europe within 20 years. Yet Hitler remained firm. Even at this stage, he maintained his public image, that he did not want war, but was being forced into it. Across Germany, there was a mood of alarm. Despite their faith in him, many feared Hitler would break his promise. Diary entries reveal that serious doubts existed, not only among the military, but also among ordinary Germans. These doubts were not openly expressed because there was no space to do so, but anxieties were present. People felt trepidation, afraid to speak out against Hitler's aims, yet fearful of another world war and its consequences for Germany. Peace in Europe hung by a thread. Then Chamberlain offered an extraordinary compromise: Hitler could have the Sudetenland, provided he promised it would be his last territorial demand. Hitler immediately replied, "Yes, yes, it is the last territorial demand I shall make in Europe." Within hours, the Munich Agreement was signed. It was an extraordinary coup. Chamberlain believed war had been averted. For Hitler, it was a double triumph. Germany's borders had expanded again, and he could continue to pose as a man of peace. Once more, he was celebrated as a national hero in Berlin. The secret conspiracy against Hitler collapsed. Hans Oster and his colleagues burned all evidence. With Chamberlain's appeasement, their courage faltered. The conspirators melted back into the army command structure. Oster, the conspiracy's leader, hid his opposition and remained a colonel in German military intelligence. Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, who had intended to shoot Hitler, joined a special forces group and would fight on the Eastern Front. General Erwin von Velban was promoted to commander-in-chief of an army group, and Fritz von Schulenburg aligned with the military establishment, later receiving a promotion. Their loss of courage freed Hitler to proceed with the next stage of his expansionist ambitions. 6 months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler tore it up. In March 1939, German troops surged through the Sudetenland and occupied all of Czechoslovakia. This was no longer merely uniting German-speaking peoples, it was territorial expansion. Yet Britain and France remained unwilling to go to war. For the German people, it seemed another astonishing triumph. Euphoria spread across Germany as they acquired not just the Sudetenland, but all of Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. This marked Hitler's first step in securing Lebensraum, the extra living space he promised the German people. This long-standing idea, dating back to the 19th century, claimed that Germany lacked sufficient territory for its population. Hitler's popularity soared. He demonstrated once again that he could take calculated risks, and make them succeed. Many hailed him as the greatest diplomat in German history. Adulatory letters and poems flooded in. A 17-year-old girl wrote that Hitler was a great man, a genius, a person sent from heaven. One Western newspaper reported that most Germans could now identify with Hitler and his achievements. What they did not know was that this would be his last major bloodless victory. The international community reacted with outrage. Stalin denounced him. Chamberlain denounced him. The French denounced him. Hitler, however, was determined to go to war. the only way to stop him would be a powerful military alliance. Even so, many Germans still believed he would not take them to war. They were mistaken. In early September, a German warship in the free port of Danzig opened fire on the Polish garrison. Meanwhile, German troops poured across the border into Poland. This time, Britain and France responded. As signatories of a treaty guaranteeing Polish independence, they had no choice but to assist Poland. On September 3, 1939, just 2 days after the German invasion, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Germany was at war. What Hitler had promised would not happen had occurred. World War II had begun. In Germany, fear and a sense of doom spread. The population had no appetite for what could be seen as a replay of the First World War, which had been catastrophic. Contemporary reports indicate that the mood in Berlin was somber and depressed. The war they had hoped to avoid had arrived. Yet the mood shifted rapidly as German forces crushed all opposition. Poland fell within weeks. The German army then turned west. War engulfed Europe, accompanied by swift victories. Germany occupied Denmark and Norway in a coordinated campaign of tanks and artillery. Soon afterward, German forces invaded Belgium and Holland, creating a military force previously unseen, absolutely devastating. This was war at its most brutal. By midsummer 1940, Hitler stood in Paris at the head of a victorious army, having defeated the combined forces of Britain and France. In front of the Eiffel Tower, he proclaimed, "I am the greatest strategic genius of all time." Many Germans who had begun to doubt him regained trust. In just a few months, with minimal losses, Germany had overrun Europe. Hitler may not have kept his promise to avoid war, but he had achieved more territorial gains than Germany had in all of World War I, a conflict lasting 4 years and costing millions of German lives. He told his senior commanders, "No one has achieved what I have achieved. I have led the German people to a great height." Hitler's military brilliance earned global recognition. National leaders in Europe and Asia rallied to his support. That summer, Italy entered the war on Germany's side. Hitler and the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini shared much in common. Hitler admired what he called the great man across the Alps, and Mussolini reciprocated, admiring Hitler's achievements. In autumn, Germany's old ally Japan joined the conflict. The Axis powers were born. Hitler seemed unstoppable. Yet the German people did not realize that the war was far from over. The devastation was only beginning.